A mother's intuition saved her son from years of hidden suffering. Tonight, we examine a deeply troubling case from the Philippines that reveals how predators exploit family trust to commit unspeakable crimes. This is the story of Brian Corrales, a young man who survived years of abuse by his own uncle. Warning: this episode discusses child exploitation and familial abuse. Listener discretion is strongly advised. I'm your host, and this is True Crime Deep Dive. Dubai, August 2016. Helen Corrales sat upright in bed at 2 a.m, her heart pounding. The nightmare had returned, the third time that week. In it, her 19-year-old son Brian was on his knees, tears streaming down his face, mouth open as if screaming, but no sound emerging. His eyes held a terror that felt viscerally real. Helen had been working as a caregiver in the United Arab Emirates for nearly 10 years. Like millions of overseas Filipino workers, she'd sacrificed proximity to family for economic opportunity. The separation was painful, but she'd convinced herself it was necessary. The monthly remittances paid for Brian's education, their home, his future. But lately, something felt wrong. The next morning, Helen initiated a video call home to La Union province. When Brian's face appeared on screen, her maternal instincts immediately triggered alarm. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, pale complexion, noticeably thinner than just weeks earlier. His usually expressive face seemed hollow, absent. "Brian, anak, are you okay?" she asked in Tagalog, searching his face for clues. He nodded mechanically. "Yes, Ma, everything's fine." But his eyes contradicted his words. In that brief moment before he looked away, Helen saw something she'd been seeing increasingly in recent calls. Fear. Not teenage angst or school stress, genuine, deep-seated fear. Then her brother Lito entered the frame, placing a hand on Brian's shoulder. "Don't worry, Ate," he said cheerfully, using the Tagalog term for older sister. "I'm taking good care of him. He's doing great in school, eating well, everything's perfect." Lito smiled broadly. Brian's smile seemed painted on. After the call ended, Helen couldn't shake her unease. She reviewed previous video calls in her mind. Brian had been changing gradually over the past year, becoming withdrawn, less talkative, avoiding eye contact. She'd attributed it to adolescence, to the normal challenges of becoming a young adult. But now, she wondered if she'd been missing something far more sinister. According to child psychology research, one of the most common indicators of ongoing abuse is behavioral changes in children or young adults. Withdrawal, depression, anxiety, avoidance of specific people or places, unexplained physical symptoms. Helen, though not formally trained in psychology, possessed something equally valuable: a mother's intimate knowledge of her child's baseline behavior. She made a decision that would alter everything. Helen approached her employer and requested emergency leave, citing a family crisis. She booked a flight to Manila without informing anyone back home. Not Lito, not even Brian. Sometimes the element of surprise reveals truths that announced visits never could. The flight felt interminable. Helen's mind cycled through possibilities. Was Brian being bullied? Was he depressed? Was something happening at school? Her imagination struggled to construct scenarios that would explain his transformation. She landed in Manila near midnight and immediately boarded a bus to La Union. The 5-hour journey through darkness gave her too much time to think. By the time she arrived at the compound where her house stood, a modest 2-story structure she'd built with years of overseas earnings, dawn was approaching. Using her duplicate key, Helen entered silently. The house was dark and still. She'd imagined a joyful surprise reunion. Instead, as she climbed the stairs toward the bedrooms, she heard sounds that made her blood run cold. Muffled crying, a struggle, voices in the darkness. What Helen discovered in her son's bedroom that night would validate every maternal instinct that had driven her across the world, and would expose a betrayal so profound it would shake her understanding of family itself. What Helen witnessed in that bedroom fundamentally altered her understanding of the past decade. Her son Brian was in clear distress, and the person causing that distress was her own brother, the man she'd entrusted with her child's care. Helen's scream shattered the night's silence. The sound carried across the compound, a primal expression of maternal anguish and rage. Leto scrambled to his feet, fumbling to dress himself. Brian remained frozen, his eyes vacant, a classic trauma response that psychologists call dissociation, where the mind detaches from overwhelming reality. "Get out!" Helen's voice cut through the chaos. "Get out of my house now!" Leto attempted to speak, to offer explanations, but Helen was beyond listening. Years of trust had evaporated in seconds. She physically pushed him toward the door. He grabbed his belongings and fled into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind a wake of devastation. In the aftermath, Helen sat beside her son, both of them crying. Brian couldn't articulate what had happened. Trauma often robs survivors of language. But Helen didn't need words. The scene she'd interrupted told her everything. As dawn broke, the full scope of Brian's suffering began to emerge. Through halting words and long silences, Brian revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. The abuse had been ongoing for years, a systematic pattern of exploitation that had begun when he was just 7 years old. According to child protection experts, perpetrators often select victims based on vulnerability and access. Leto had both. As Brian's guardian while Helen worked overseas, he possessed unsupervised access and authority. He'd used classic predatory tactics: gradual boundary violations, threats to ensure silence, and manipulation of family dynamics. The first incident occurred in 2013, when Brian was 7. He'd been lying on the living room sofa when Leto approached him inappropriately. Brian wanted to scream, to run, but fear paralyzed him. Leto's threats were clear. If Brian told anyone, there would be consequences, not just for Brian, but for his mother working abroad. This threat was particularly effective. Children of overseas workers often carry enormous guilt about their parents' sacrifice. Brian didn't want to jeopardize his mother's job or create problems, so he remained silent, believing he was protecting her. The abuse continued intermittently over the years. Brian learned survival strategies: locking his bedroom door, staying at friends' houses, avoiding being alone with his uncle. To outsiders, his increasing withdrawal seemed like typical teenage behavior: moodiness, antisocial tendencies, academic struggles. His friends noticed changes but misinterpreted them. Teachers saw a quiet student becoming quieter. Relatives commented that he'd become less friendly as he matured. No one suspected the truth hiding beneath these behavioral shifts. During video calls with Helen, Brian became an actor. He'd smile, say he was fine, and quickly end conversations. Often, Leto would be visible in the background, a silent reminder of the consequences of honesty. Brian learned to communicate through what he didn't say, through his eyes, through subtle distress signals that only a mother might detect. In April 2016, 4 months before Helen's return, the situation escalated dramatically. Leto hosted a birthday celebration, inviting several friends. That night, Brian experienced what legal documents would later describe as assault by multiple perpetrators. The details are too disturbing to describe here, but the incident represented a severe escalation in the abuse pattern. After that night, Brian's psychological state deteriorated markedly. He began experiencing symptoms consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder: hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, emotional numbness, and severe anxiety. He avoided home whenever possible, sometimes wandering the streets late at night rather than returning to the house. This is when Helen began noticing the changes during their calls. The hollow eyes, the weight loss, the fear she couldn't quite identify, but absolutely felt. Helen's unexpected return that August night wasn't random chance. It was maternal intuition acting on subconscious pattern recognition. The brain detecting anomalies that conscious thought hadn't yet processed. The morning after Helen's discovery, neither she nor Brian slept. Helen sat in the kitchen, gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Brian remained in his room, clutching a pillow. The first night in years he'd felt genuinely safe in that house. As soon as the local barangay hall opened, the barangay being the smallest administrative division in the Philippines, similar to a neighborhood council, Helen and Brian went directly to the authorities. This initial step is crucial in the Philippine legal system for cases involving minors and family disputes. The barangay officials provided an endorsement letter, which Helen and Brian took to the municipal police station. This is where Brian's true courage emerged. Despite years of enforced silence, despite the shame and fear that abuse survivors commonly experience, Brian gave his statement to police investigators. Research shows that reporting familial abuse is extraordinarily difficult. Victims face multiple barriers: fear of not being believed, concern about family consequences, shame, and loyalty conflicts. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, only about 30% of child sexual abuse cases are ever reported to authorities. Brian was joining a minority of survivors who find the strength to speak up. As Brian recounted his experiences, Helen wept, not just for what had happened, but for all the warning signs she'd missed while working thousands of miles away to provide financial stability. The next critical step was the medico-legal examination. Brian was taken to a hospital where forensic medical professionals conducted a thorough evaluation. These examinations serve dual purposes: providing medical care to survivors and documenting evidence for legal proceedings. The process was undoubtedly traumatic. Survivors often describe forensic examinations as a necessary but difficult re-violation of their autonomy. However, Brian understood its importance. The medical findings confirmed what Helen already knew. There was clear physical evidence of repeated, long-term abuse. Simultaneously, Helen discovered additional evidence on Brian's old cell phone: disturbing messages from Lito via social media. These messages, combined with the medical findings and Brian's testimony, built a compelling case. Philippine law enforcement moved swiftly. An arrest warrant was issued for Lito Corrales under Republic Act 7610, the Special Protection of Children Against Abuse, Exploitation, and Discrimination Act. This comprehensive law, enacted in 1992, specifically addresses child abuse cases and carries severe penalties. Lito was apprehended several days later based on information from a community member. When questioned at the police station, he denied all allegations. His defense strategy was predictable. He claimed Brian and Helen had fabricated the accusations to steal the property Helen had purchased. This defense tactic, known as blame the victim, is unfortunately common in abuse cases, but the evidence was overwhelming. Beyond Brian's testimony and the medical findings, investigators had the chat messages showing Lito's inappropriate communications with his nephew. The documentary evidence was particularly damning. Digital communications often provide irrefutable proof in modern criminal cases. The investigation also uncovered something even more disturbing. 3 of Lito's friends were implicated in the abuse. These men, who had attended Lito's birthday celebration in April 2016, were also arrested and charged under RA 7610, specifically for acts of lasciviousness, a legal term describing lewd conduct with a minor. All 4 suspects were detained without bail. The prosecutor's office determined that the severity of the charges and the strength of the evidence warranted keeping them in custody throughout the legal proceedings. In the Philippine justice system, certain crimes against children are considered non-bailable offenses, reflecting the gravity with which such cases are treated. Throughout the preliminary hearings and investigation phase, Helen attended every proceeding. Her presence wasn't just supportive, it was transformative for Brian. Abuse survivors often describe feeling alone and unsupported. Having a parent who unequivocally believes and stands with them can be healing in itself. The case moved forward to trial. Brian would soon face his greatest challenge, testifying in open court about the most painful experiences of his young life. The trial began in early 2017, several months after the arrests. For Brian, now 20 years old, the courtroom represented both his greatest fear and his only path to genuine freedom. Testifying meant reliving trauma publicly, but silence would mean allowing his abusers to escape accountability. Philippine criminal proceedings in cases involving minors include special protections. Brian was allowed to testify in a manner that minimized additional trauma. The court could clear the gallery during sensitive testimony, and he had access to victim support services throughout the process. On the day Brian testified, Helen sat in the courtroom's front row. Her presence was a lifeline. Research on trauma survivors consistently shows that social support, particularly from family members who believe and validate the survivor's experience, significantly improves both legal outcomes and long-term psychological recovery. Brian's testimony was detailed and consistent. He described the progression of abuse from age 7 through his teenage years, the threats that kept him silent, the isolation he experienced, and the escalation that occurred in April 2016. His account was measured, factual, and heartbreaking. Defense attorneys employed common tactics in such cases, attempting to cast doubt on the timeline, questioning why Brian hadn't reported earlier, suggesting possible ulterior motives. These strategies, while legally permissible, often re-traumatize survivors by implying they're somehow complicit in their own abuse. But the prosecution had built a formidable case. Beyond Brian's testimony, they presented the medical legal examination results, showing physical evidence consistent with repeated abuse over an extended period. Forensic medical experts testified about their findings, explaining the physiological markers of long-term trauma. The digital evidence proved particularly compelling. The chat messages between Lito and Brian, recovered from the old cell phone, showed a clear pattern of grooming behavior and inappropriate communication. Digital forensics experts authenticated the messages, confirming they hadn't been fabricated or altered. Perhaps most damning was the psychological evaluation. A licensed psychologist who had been working with Brian testified about his diagnosis: complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. This condition develops after prolonged, repeated trauma, particularly when the victim cannot escape the situation. The psychologist explained how Brian's symptoms, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, difficulty trusting others, severe anxiety, were entirely consistent with the abuse he described. CPTSD differs from standard PTSD in important ways. While PTSD typically results from a single traumatic event or short-term trauma, CPTSD develops from chronic, ongoing trauma, exactly what Brian experienced over 12 years. The defense's central argument, that Helen and Brian fabricated the accusations for financial gain, collapsed under scrutiny. Investigators had thoroughly examined the property ownership records. The house was legally Helen's, purchased with her documented overseas earnings. Lito had no ownership claim. The supposed financial motive simply didn't exist. Furthermore, the prosecution demonstrated that Brian had displayed classic signs of abuse that predated Helen's discovery. School records showed his academic decline and increased absenteeism. Former teachers testified about behavioral changes they'd observed. Friends described his gradual withdrawal from social activities. The three co-defendants also faced overwhelming evidence. Witnesses placed them at Leto's house during the April 2016 gathering. Their own social media posts geolocated them at the residence on that date. Brian's testimony about that night, though difficult to hear, was specific and detailed. Throughout the trial, Leto maintained his innocence, but his defense offered no credible alternative explanation for the evidence. His attorneys couldn't explain the medical findings, the messages, or the consistent testimony from multiple witnesses. The trial lasted several months, with periodic hearings as the court reviewed evidence and heard testimony. Each session was emotionally exhausting for Brian and Helen, but they persisted. Finally, in 2018, the court delivered its verdict. The judge's voice was firm and clear as she read the decision. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing in 2018 marked a pivotal moment, not just for Brian and Helen, but for the broader conversation about familial abuse in the Philippines. The judge's words carried weight that extended far beyond that courtroom. For Lito Corrales, the sentence was severe and unambiguous: reclusion perpetua. In the Philippine legal system, this translates to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 30 years without the possibility of parole. This is one of the harshest penalties available under Philippine law, reserved for the most egregious crimes. The sentence reflected several aggravating factors. First, the abuse occurred over an extended period, 12 years, demonstrating a pattern of predatory behavior rather than an isolated incident. Second, Leto held a position of trust and authority as Brian's guardian, making the betrayal particularly heinous. Third, the victim was a minor for the majority of the abuse period, invoking enhanced protections under Republic Act 7610. The three co-defendants each received 20-year sentences without eligibility for bail. While shorter than Leto's sentence, these terms reflected their participation in the April 2016 incident and their violation of laws protecting children from sexual exploitation. As the judge read the sentences, Brian sat quietly beside his mother. There were no dramatic outbursts, no theatrical reactions, just a profound, quiet relief. For the first time in over a decade, Brian could breathe freely. The man who had terrorized him would spend the rest of his productive life behind bars. But justice in a courtroom, while necessary, doesn't automatically heal psychological wounds. Brian's real journey was just beginning. Helen connected Brian with a non-governmental organization specializing in trauma recovery for abuse survivors. These organizations, which operate throughout the Philippines and globally, provide services often unavailable through government channels. Specialized therapy, support groups, legal advocacy, and educational assistance. Brian began attending weekly therapy sessions. Initially, he struggled to articulate his experiences. Trauma often disrupts language processing and memory consolidation. Therapists working with abuse survivors use specialized techniques. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and narrative therapy approaches. Research consistently demonstrates that early intervention after trauma disclosure significantly improves long-term outcomes. Survivors who receive appropriate psychological support within the first year after disclosure show better mental health trajectories than those who don't access services until years later. The NGO also provided Brian with something equally valuable: community. Support groups connected him with other survivors, young men and women who understood his experience in ways that even well-meaning family members couldn't. This peer support reduced his sense of isolation and normalized his healing process. One of the most profound aspects of trauma recovery is the survivor's ability to reclaim their narrative. For 12 years, Leto had controlled Brian's story, dictating what he could say, who he could tell, how he should behave. The trial began returning that control to Brian, but therapy completed the process. Brian made a decision that surprised some observers, but made perfect sense to those who understood trauma's complexities. He chose to study psychology. The NGO provided a scholarship that covered his tuition and expenses, allowing him to pursue higher education despite the interrupted schooling during his teenage years. This choice wasn't about dwelling on the past. It was about transforming suffering into purpose. Many trauma survivors report that helping others who've experienced similar situations becomes part of their own healing process. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where individuals develop increased resilience, deeper relationships, and stronger sense of purpose after overcoming significant adversity. Brian excelled in his studies. His personal experience, while painful, gave him unique insights into trauma psychology that textbooks alone couldn't provide. He understood viscerally what survivors face: the shame, the self-blame, the difficulty trusting others, the hypervigilance that exhausts. After graduation, Brian began working with the same NGO that had supported him, this time as a counselor, helping other young abuse survivors navigate their own recovery journeys. His transformation from victim to advocate represented something powerful: the refusal to let trauma define one's entire existence. Several months after the sentencing, Helen made a decision that would symbolize their new beginning. She sold the house in La Union, the property she'd worked a decade overseas to afford. That structure, once a symbol of her sacrifice and dreams, had become a monument to trauma. Real estate transactions can be purely financial, but this sale represented something deeper: the recognition that healing sometimes requires physically leaving painful spaces behind. Environmental psychology research shows that locations associated with trauma can trigger ongoing stress responses, making recovery more difficult. Helen and Brian relocated to a quieter municipality in Pangasinan province, several hours from La Union. The distance provided both physical and psychological separation from relatives, from community gossip, from the constant reminders of what had happened. Helen didn't return to overseas work. After years of sacrifice, missing birthdays, graduations, daily moments, she chose proximity over income. She opened a small food stall in the local public market, selling traditional Filipino home-cooked meals. The income was modest compared to her Dubai salary, but it allowed her to be present for her son during his recovery. This decision reflects a broader reality for many overseas Filipino workers. The economic imperative that drives them abroad often conflicts with family needs. Helen had left to provide financial security, but her absence had created a vulnerability that Lito exploited. Her return represented a recalibration of priorities, choosing emotional presence over economic optimization. Brian's recovery wasn't linear. Trauma healing rarely follows a predictable trajectory. Some weeks brought progress, others involved setbacks. He experienced flashbacks, anxiety attacks, and periods of depression, all normal responses to extraordinary circumstances. But with consistent therapy, family support, and time, Brian began reclaiming aspects of his personality that trauma had suppressed. He started socializing again, carefully rebuilding trust in relationships. He discovered interests beyond mere survival: photography, volunteer work, academic pursuits. His psychology studies became more than career preparation. They became a framework for understanding his own experience. Learning about trauma's neurobiological effects, about survival mechanisms, about recovery pathways. All of this helped Brian contextualize his responses and recognize that his reactions were adaptive, not pathological. By his mid-20s, Brian had completed his degree and begun working professionally with abuse survivors. His colleagues described him as empathetic, patient, and remarkably insightful, qualities forged through personal experience. Helen watched her son's transformation with quiet pride. The frightened, withdrawn young man she'd discovered in 2016 had evolved into someone resilient and purposeful. Their story wasn't one of perfect healing. Trauma leaves permanent marks. But it was a story of survival, resistance, and ultimately, hope. Brian's case, while extraordinary in its resolution, reflects a disturbing global pattern. Familial abuse, perpetrated by relatives or trusted family friends, represents approximately 30 to 40% of all reported child sexual abuse cases worldwide. The actual prevalence is likely much higher, as these cases are chronically underreported. Why is familial abuse so common yet so hidden? Several factors converge to create what researchers call perfect storm conditions for concealment. First, there's the trust factor. Families inherently trust relatives with child care, often without the background checks or supervision applied to outside caregivers. This access, combined with authority, creates vulnerability. Second, perpetrators exploit family loyalty. Children fear they won't be believed if they accuse a family member, or they worry about causing family disruption. In Brian's case, Leto explicitly threatened consequences if Brian disclosed the abuse, a common tactic that weaponizes the child's love and concern for family members. Third, there's the phenomenon of grooming, the gradual process by which perpetrators normalize inappropriate behavior. Grooming isn't sudden, it's incremental. Boundaries are violated slowly, testing the victim's response, establishing new normals that become progressively more exploitative. Research from organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children shows that grooming typically follows predictable stages: targeting vulnerable children, gaining trust, filling needs the child has, isolating the child, sexualizing the relationship, and maintaining control through secrecy and threats. Leto's approach followed this blueprint precisely. He positioned himself as Brian's caregiver and protector while Helen worked abroad. He initially provided legitimate care, establishing himself as trustworthy. Then, he gradually violated boundaries, testing Brian's responses. When Brian didn't or couldn't resist, Leto escalated. Finally, he ensured silence through threats that exploited Brian's love for his mother. The overseas employment context added another layer of vulnerability. The Philippines sends millions of workers abroad annually, an economic necessity that creates family separations. While this provides financial benefits, it can also create supervisory gaps that predators exploit. This isn't to blame Helen or other overseas workers. They make tremendous sacrifices for their families' well-being. Rather, it's to acknowledge a systemic vulnerability that requires collective attention. What protected Brian ultimately was his mother's intuition and willingness to act on it. Many abuse cases continue because adults dismiss concerning signs, rationalize behavioral changes, or avoid confronting uncomfortable possibilities. Helen's decision to return unannounced, to trust her instincts over her brother's reassurances, literally saved her son. Her immediate action, going to authorities rather than trying to handle it privately, ensured proper documentation and legal accountability. Brian's story offers lessons beyond its individual tragedy, about vigilance, about believing children, about the importance of maintaining connection even across distances. As we close Brian's story, it's important to extract meaningful lessons from this case, insights that might help protect other children and support other survivors. First, trust your instincts. Helen's maternal intuition detected something wrong, despite thousands of miles of distance and Leto's reassurances. Parents, guardians, and caring adults should pay attention to behavioral changes in children. Withdrawal, anxiety, sleep disturbances, sudden personality shifts, or reluctance around specific individuals. These aren't definitive proof of abuse, but they warrant gentle investigation. Second, create safe disclosure pathways. Children need to know they can report uncomfortable situations without facing punishment or disbelief. Research shows that children who feel they'll be believed are more likely to disclose abuse early, preventing prolonged trauma. Regular, private conversations about body autonomy and appropriate touch establish frameworks for these discussions. Third, recognize that perpetrators are often people we know and trust. Stranger danger, while important, represents a minority of abuse cases. Most perpetrators are family members, family friends, coaches, teachers, or others in positions of authority. This reality requires vigilance even, or especially, with trusted individuals. Fourth, understand that delayed disclosure is normal, not suspicious. Defense attorneys often question why victims don't report immediately. But trauma research consistently shows that delayed disclosure is typical. Fear, shame, threats, developmental immaturity, and loyalty conflicts all contribute to silence. Brian's 12-year silence doesn't undermine his credibility. It confirms the power dynamics that trapped him. Fifth, support survivors unconditionally. Helen's unwavering belief in and support for Brian was crucial to his recovery and to the successful prosecution. Many abuse cases fail because family members prioritize family reputation over the victim's well-being, or they pressure victims to recant to avoid scandal. Sixth, recognize recovery as a journey, not a destination. Brian's story didn't end with the conviction. He continues working on healing, building healthy relationships, and finding meaning in his experience. Trauma leaves lasting impacts, but survivors can build fulfilling lives beyond their trauma. Brian's decision to become a counselor for other survivors represents what researchers call post-traumatic growth, finding purpose and meaning through adversity. Not all survivors choose this path, and that's perfectly valid. But for Brian, helping others became part of his healing. Today, Brian works with an NGO, conducting outreach in schools, training teachers to recognize abuse signs, and counseling young survivors. His lived experience, combined with professional training, makes him uniquely effective. Survivors who work with him often comment that his understanding feels different, deeper, more authentic, because he's walked their path. Helen runs her food stall, maintaining the steady presence she couldn't provide while working overseas. Their relationship, once strained by distance and secrets, has deepened through shared trauma and recovery. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out. Resources are available. In the United States, the National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours at 1-800-4-A-CHILD. You are not alone, and help is possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Crime Deep Dive.